Welcome new and old friends, my name is 242 and today 42 got us one story. It's by Britten. That's right, he's back. And this time he has a story about a gnome whose eyes seem to follow you no matter where you are. Whether you're looking out the window of your house or if you're walking your dog down the street, those eyes just never seem to leave you. If you're on YouTube, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment. All this helps the algorithm know that others might enjoy this channel as well. If you're on the podcast, please remember to follow and leave a review if possible. Now, with all that being said, turn off your lights, make sure your doors and windows are locked. Things are about to get spooky. Throughout my life, I have lived in the shadows of my twin sister who died in the womb. As my parents would always point out, she would have probably been much more successful than I was. I now lie in a hospital bed and I'm forced to listen to my parents tell me that my sister would have had the foresight to check if a railing could support her weight before using it to try to kill herself. The Gnome by Britten. A quick trigger warning before this story starts. There is cruelty to animals and cruelty to children. If this is something you don't wish to hear, please check out another video of mine. Now, on with the story. Toby didn't trust the gnome in Miss Haberfield's garden. Since it appeared 2 weeks ago, Toby had started avoiding going out in the front yard if he could help it. At 12 years old, he knew it was stupid, childish, but every time he went outside or even glanced out the window, he could feel the gnome's eyes on him. It looked like a normal garden gnome, with its jaunty red hat and red overalls over a green shirt, a pickaxe tossed against its shoulder as if it were about to whistle its way to work, about 1.5 feet tall from its boots to the top of its peaked cap. Toby hovered at the living room window and looked out. There it was, at the edge of Miss Haberfield's porch stairs. A knowing smile quirked its lips. Its eyes looked entirely too real as they bored right into Toby from all the way across the road. Wordsworth whined and scratched the front door, the Cocker Spaniel impeding Toby's actions at the window as a precursor to going out. "Toby, are you taking Wordy out for a walk?" Toby's mom asked from across the house. "I wasn't going to, no," Toby said. "Come on, take him for a walk. You haven't taken him out in days." Reluctantly, Toby fetched Wordsworth's leash and clipped it to his collar. The dog showed no hesitation about going outside, leaping and making an exciting whine. Toby kept his eyes lowered as he left the house and walked down the driveway. When he looked up, the gnome appeared to be staring right at him. Childish, stupid, it was a dumb piece of lawn decoration, and yet Toby couldn't escape the uncomfortable feeling that crawled the length of his spine. Toby could feel the garden gnome's painted stare on his back as he walked Wordy up the block, until they were all the way out of sight. At the end of their street, the Holloway Bridge crossed a small but deep ravine. Strips of nature ran along both sides of the gap. Toby steered the dog down a dirt path. A chain-link fence separated them from the drop-off, which was steep and ended in a rocky bottom covered in scrub. Wordsworth stopped every few strides to sniff and spray urine, or more often both. It gave Toby plenty of time to think. Staring at the ravine, he found an idea forming. Toby circled the next block and walked Wordsworth back up the street from the other direction. Nonetheless, as soon as he got close enough, he could see the gnome staring. He knew some optical illusions could make it seem like certain paintings or statues were always watching you no matter which direction you looked at them from. But the gnome really did seem to turn to face him, only subtly, wherever he went. Heading down, Toby reached the bottom of the driveway and turned towards the house, but suddenly Wordy pulled him to a stop. The Cocker Spaniel's eyes fixed on the garden gnome directly across the road. Toby tugged on his lead. Wordy whined and backed up, but seemed reluctant to turn his back on the gnome. Toby pulled harder, and both of them retreated to the house, locked the door, and he went to check the front window again. The gnome hadn't moved. Of course it hadn't. But its eyes met Toby's, and it smiled that knowing smile. A plan turned in Toby's mind. That night, after his parents had gone to sleep, Toby dressed again in the dark, pulling jeans and a t-shirt over his pajamas, and pushing his feet into a pair of sneakers. After he'd been sent to bed, he had lain awake for the last couple hours. Stupid or not, he felt too amped up to sleep. Part of him wanted to laugh at himself for being so crazy, but the laughter wouldn't come. Creeping through the house, Toby eased the front door open. Wordsworth in his bed in the living room stirred but didn't wake. Toby gently pushed the door closed again as he stepped outside, leaving it unlocked. He used his phone as a flashlight. The street was a different world at night. He'd never been outside by himself this late and had underestimated just how alien it would feel. His pulse quickened. For a long moment, he was so distracted taking it in that he forgot why he was outside to begin with. The night air settled cool and damp on Toby's skin. A couple of powerful halogen lights shone down at the end of the street, near the entrance to the bridge. Another lamppost set on the far end of the block, but everything in between was webbed in shadows. All the windows of the houses surrounding their own were dark, including those of Miss Hubbardsfield's house. Only in the distance could he hear a muffled television set. No cars went by, and everything appeared still and silent. Remembering his purpose, Toby looked across the road at Miss Hubbardsfield's house. There, in the garden, the silhouette of the garden gnome with its peaked hat shadowed in the corner of her front stairs. Toby hesitated. His hand, holding his phone, shivered. Looking both ways, Toby crossed the empty street. He didn't have any excuses for being outside by himself at this time of night. He couldn't tell his parents or anyone else his real reason, of course, but he didn't know what else he could say if he was caught. He was extra cautious as he entered Miss Hubbardsfield's yard, feeling the spongy grass under his sneakers. Toby's heart hammered against his chest as he neared the gnome. Briefly, he directed his flashlight towards the statue, and immediately regretted it. Its eyes, painted on though they might be, locked directly onto his. Its smirk dared him to come closer. Was this what it wanted, somehow? To lure him in? No, it was a statue. It didn't want anything. It was just a creepy statue, and Toby was going to be rid of it soon. He just wasn't going to look at it in the face while he did it. The air around the gnome felt thick and electric, like the coming of a storm. It was all in his head, Toby told himself as he snuck closer and closer. His hand shook as he reached for it. His nerves screamed that something was about to happen. And all it would have taken was a single sound or movement nearby to send him sprinting home. But nothing interrupted, and he grabbed the gnome. It felt cool and heavy. Heavier than Toby expected, but it came loose from the garden all the same, dirt crumbling off its little black boots. Toby carried the gnome awkwardly as he hurried out of Miss Hedfield's yard, holding it away from its body like something that stank and making sure it faced away from him. Nothing and nobody stopped him as he took off down the street. Heart pumping so hard it made him feel sick, and yet a little bit thrilled. He certainly didn't want anyone to spot him now. The bridge was recently new, a big erector set of steel grating and crisscrossing gritters. It was only 2 lanes with a sidewalk down one side. The fences that ran down both sides would have been awkward to climb. Toby carried the gnome to the middle of the bridge over the deepest part of the ravine. Toby gave the garden gnome one final look. Nothing about it changed. Its level stare and knowing smile, pick tossed against one shoulder. It, of course, raised no voice in protest. Putting his phone in his pocket, Toby could still see thanks to the halogen lights on either side of the bridge, surrounded by armies of swarmy moths. He took the gnome in both hands and raised it above his head, backing away from the fence. Weighing in his hands, he threw the statue with all of his strength. The garden gnome arced over the top of the fence. Its smirking face caught the light. It seemed to hang in mid-air for a heartbeat, then, twisting, turning end over end, it dropped from view. Toby hurried back to the fence and listened. The stream winding through the bottom of the ravine was pretty small. He should have heard the gnome shatter on the rocks below, but instead he heard nothing. Nothing at all. Toby's parents noticed what a good mood he was in the next day. They put it down to him enjoying the school holidays, but Toby felt like a weight had been taken off his shoulders. The gnome was gone, and, more importantly, nothing had happened when he got rid of it. Those spooked feelings had been in his head the whole time. He could move on, and in time, forget the whole thing ever happened. "You're not up to something, are you?" his mother asked. "Planning on throwing a party while we're out tonight?"
What? What are you talking about?
"Your father and I are going out tonight, remember?" "I'm only kidding. You're going to be all right at home by yourself?"
"Oh, yeah, I'll be fine."
It rained off and on most of the day, so Toby stayed inside playing video games. When his mom and dad were getting ready to leave, it was misty and turning dark outside, on the verge of another downpour. Toby followed them out to the driveway. "We should be home by 10 o'clock, his mother said. "But call us if you need anything at all. Keep the door locked and don't talk to anyone." Toby went to reply, but his words died in his mouth. He felt his heart stop. The gnome, it was back in the same spot, at the corner of Miss Halbertsfield's front steps, where Toby had snatched it from last night. But no, it was impossible. He actually rubbed his eyes to make sure he wasn't seeing things, like a cartoon. The same knowing smile under its black beard, the same red overalls and hat, the same eyes boring into his. It couldn't have climbed out of the ravine by itself. It couldn't have been recovered. It should have been shattered into 100 pieces and remained totally lost. For a few moments, Toby thought he must have imagined the whole thing. The last night was just a dream. But no, it was real. He had gotten rid of the garden gnome, and yet now it was back. Toby, are you all right?" Toby snapped out of it.
Yeah, I'm okay, I'm fine."
"Okay, well, be good and call us if you need us." "You can order off Uber Eats, buddy. Have them leave it at the door," Toby's dad said. "And only 2 beers from the fridge." "John," his mother laughed. "Okay, 1 beer. Be good, kiddo." Toby watched his parents climb into the car and drive away, rain dampening his hair. He raised his hand and waved, but his breath felt frozen in his lungs. Across the street, unmoving but always watchful, the gnome stared and smirked. Once Toby went back inside, he locked the door and went to the living room window. Rain began to splatter the glass. As if sensing his discomfort, Wordsworth whined behind him. The gnome was still there, of course, but Toby would swear it had swerved slightly to face the window instead of their driveway. Miss Halbertsfield must have gotten another gnome. It's the only thing that made sense, nothing supernatural about it. She really liked the statue, and as soon as she had seen it was missing, she'd gone and bought another one from the same place as the first. Maybe, for whatever reason, She had already had a spare in the garage or a seat in the backyard instead of the front, which she had brought out when she noticed the first one was gone. He had proven there was nothing to worry about when he picked up and carried off the gnome last night. But he never heard it land, he thought. Toby couldn't get that thought out of his mind, that he never heard the gnome smash as it hit the ravine floor.
Don't be crazy,
Toby said to himself.
If it's such a problem, I can just go and get rid of that one too.
Toby felt very alone in the empty house. It was only recently that his parents decided he was old enough to stay home by himself anyway. And to be honest, he did get a little anxiety every time. He kept Wordsworth close. The rain got heavier as the light outside dimmed. Toby tried to ignore it by watching some streaming shows his mom wouldn't usually approve of. He avoided checking the window. Eventually, he ordered food. Not because he was really hungry, but for something else to use as a distraction. After half an hour, someone knocked on the front door. Woody barked and leapt off the couch. Toby had put in the instructions to leave the food at the front door, but he knew sometimes the drivers ignored that.
Hello?
Toby asked. Delivery for you.
Leave it on the door, please.
The driver left the food and retreated into the storm. Toby heard their car drive off. Opening the door, he gathered the brown paper sack. He couldn't help but look up and peer across the street to check on the gnome. And again, his blood froze. The garden gnome no longer stood sanitarily at the foot of Miss Habitsfield's front step, but now sat, devoid of context, in the middle of her lawn. Its eyes met Toby's through the rain. He actually gasped and reeled back inside the house with his food, locking the door behind him.
No, it couldn't. It wasn't,
Toby said.
Someone must have moved it. It can't move by itself.
Toby sat on the couch, brooding, while his burger and fries went cold. Wordy saddled up beside him, at first just hoping for some scraps, but then sensing his master's distress. When Toby could stand it no longer, he went to the window to check the street. Lightning strobed, accompanied moments later by a pearl of thunder. In the flash, Toby saw the gnome had moved even closer. Now it stood by Miss Habitsfield's mailbox, right at the edge of her yard. In every other respect, it was the same, smiling, pickaxe on its shoulder, rain down the side of its peaked hat.
No.
Did someone know what he did? Were they playing some kind of prank on him? But if this was a practical joke, then Toby didn't know who could possibly be behind it. He left the window and went to double-check the front door was locked. It was, but he immediately regretted taking his eyes off the gnome. Toby returned to the window, Wordsworth scrambling underfoot, yipping. For a few long moments, the street was too dark and rainy for him to see anything. Then, lightning lit up the sky and Toby saw, to his growing horror, that the mailbox stood alone. In that brief fraction of a second, his eyes searched the rest of Miss Habitsfield's yard, but he couldn't see the gnome anywhere. The street lapsed back into blackness. Toby stayed where he was, breathing hard. His breath misted the glass. The next lightning strike seemed to take an hour to arrive. When it did, he spotted the garden gnome instantly. It had crossed the road in a straight line and now stood at the edge of Toby's yard instead. Its back faced the street as it smirked at Toby's window.
No, it's coming.
Toby looked at his phone and wondered whether to call his parents. What would he say? That he was being stalked by a living garden gnome? He'd have to tell him what he did last night, and he couldn't do that. Toby ran to the kitchen instead and yanked open the junk drawer. There, along with other things, was a simple claw hammer with a rubber grip. It seemed like the most logical weapon to use against a living statue. Wielding it in one hand, he returned to the front door. Thunder bellowed overhead. Wordy had been running back and forth, unbothered by the rain and thunder. Suddenly, the Cocker Spaniel's behavior changed. Fur raised on his back. He turned towards the front door and began to growl. He seemed immediately wary of someone or something right outside. Toby scanned the front lawn. In the dark and rain, he couldn't see the gnome. All he could say for sure was that it wasn't the edge of the yard where he had last seen it. A car drove by, wheels sluicing through the water on the road, and its light bathed the lawn for long enough to confirm that the gnome wasn't there. Based on Wordy's reaction, it was easy to imagine the garden gnome standing right outside the front door. Holding the hammer, Toby tried to angle around, but he couldn't get a good view of the front door even while pressing his face to the glass. Suddenly, lightning cracked the sky open and thunder exploded almost directly overhead. The power went out and their house was plunged into darkness. Immediately outside the window, where Toby's face was pressed, the gnome appeared. In the blue-white flash bulb of lightning, its eyes drilled right into Toby's. Toby screamed and launched himself away from the window. In the darkness, he swung the hammer wildly and was lucky he didn't smash anything. Wordsworth yelped and started barking, running around in confusion. The power didn't come back on. Toby panted, breathing hard. He stumbled into the couch and then crawled across it, groping with his free hand. Eventually, he found his phone laying on the arm of the couch. He thought about calling his parents. Nothing he could say would make sense. He'd be just raving crazy, but it didn't matter anymore. If he just told them to come home and that he needed them, they would just come. Before he could act on the thought, though, he felt it. He felt the weight of the gnome's stare. Toby turned on the phone's flashlight. Its small but powerful beam filled the room, making everything colorless. Wordy whined and barked. The dog stood in the entry but turned towards the other side of the living room. Slowly, fearfully, Toby moved the flashlight to the same direction. The gnome stood on the corner of his family's dining table, its eyes fixed on Toby, still wearing its knowing smirk. It had clearly come from outside. Raindrops ran down its tapered top of the red cap, over its face, its overalls, and down to its dirty boots.
"No, get out! You can't be in here! Get out!"
Toby yelled. Toby was still holding the hammer, but he didn't dare get close enough to use it. Last night he had picked up the gnome and carried it with no trouble, but that sense that it was all a lure, bait for some kind of trap, returned tenfold. He backed away. Dropping the hammer, he grabbed Wordy by the collar instead. The dog whined and barked, wanting to charge the gnome. Together they reversed into the hallway, the gnome watching them the whole way, somehow turning without turning. The two of them retreated down the corridor to Toby's bedroom. The boy dragged the Cocker Spaniel by the collar. Thunder rolled outside. Wordy tugged on Toby's grip as if wanting to defend his home from the intruder, letting loose with a full-throated barks. Toby reached the bedroom doorway, planning to lock himself inside. He kept his eyes on the corridor, afraid to blink. Suddenly, Wordy's collar slipped from his hand. Barking, the dog sprinted back down the hall and into the living room.
"Wordy, no!"
Toby froze, half in and half out of his bedroom doorway. His dog disappeared around the corner, still barking. He could hear Wordy confronting the gnome, although it sounded one-sided. And then the dog let out a wretched howl. Toby heard him whine and then shrieking. The sounds were awful. Toby had never heard the dog make noises like that, didn't know he could make such noises, and they cut through the heart of him. Toby heard a terrible pop and the dog's cries silenced instantly. A grotesque and grisly cracking sound made its way down the corridor. Something splashed like water hitting a wall or a ceiling. The noise went on for some time.
"Wordy? Wordy?"
Step by step, Toby returned down the hall. Aside from the sound of the rain, another crack of thunder, the house had fallen silent again. His heart pounded. Reaching the end of the hall, he angled his flashlight around the corner. The gnome was gone from the table. In the middle of the room, right in front of where it had been standing, was a ragged mass of fur and flesh, blood pooling on the tiles. Toby grabbed his mouth and made a strangled noise. He'd never seen anything so horrible. It was like Wordsworth had been hit by a truck. No, it was worse. It was like the dog had been picked up on both ends and wrung out like a wet towel. Limbs and tufts of fur and unrecognizable things stuck out at a mess of angles.
No, please, no.
Toby felt like he was going to be sick. His poor Wordy. Even worse than the thought of his pet dying so horribly was the realization that he could be about to die the same way. Toby backed away again down the hall. He couldn't spot the gnome. He didn't know where it had gone. His legs went weak and he fell against one of the walls, dragging himself most of the way. When he reached his bedroom, he threw himself against the door and shoved its meager push-button lock into place. Breathing hard, Toby raised his phone. With a sense of inevitability, he felt the weight of the gnome's stare on his back. Slowly, he turned and used his flashlight to scan the room. He didn't even register surprise as he saw it was standing on the middle of his bed. The last of the rainwater pooling on the bedspread. Its eyes met his. All Toby could feel was terror. Shrieking against the doorframe, he let out a shrill scream. The next morning, the results of last night's rain dried on the street. A police cruiser pulled to a halt in front of Toby and his parents' house. 2 officers climbed out and hitched their equipment belts. They looked dejected as they approached the house. Only seconds after they knocked, the door was snatched open. Toby's mother swiped at her tear-stained face. His father looked just as pale and withdrawn, joining her in the doorway.
Have you found him? Have you found our son? I'm very sorry, Miss Golfton, Mr. Golfton.
Neither officer could meet the couple's eyes.
Your son is no longer with us.
Toby's mother wailed and collapsed, her husband catching her before she hit the ground. His face spasmed, too overwhelmed to process what he was hearing.
How? Where?
The ravine down at the end of the street. Maybe it was some kind of accident last night in the rain. It's possible he was thrown down there.
I need to see him, my baby.
The 2 cops thought back to the condition in which the boy had been discovered.
I don't think that would be a good idea just yet, ma'am. Not until the investigation can rule some things out.
The sight of police cruisers drew several curious neighbors. Keeping their distance, a few gathered across the street at the edge of Miss Habbersfield's yard. Miss Habbersfield herself, a stocky woman in her early 70s, walked down the driveway with a steaming mug of coffee in her hands.
Do you know what's going on?
Another neighbor, Reggie, asked.
The police knocked on my door last night, woke me up,
Miss Habbersfield said.
Not that I sleep very well these days. Apparently their young boy, Toby, has gone missing. They gone out for the night, and when they came home, he and his pet dog were gone.
Oh, that's terrible. Oh, the police are back now. It's probably not good news. Craning his neck, Reggie tried to peer past the 2 cops to get a better look at what was happening inside. As he did, he accidentally caught the eye of Mr. Grafton. The man's expression was so tortured and raw that Reggie immediately felt like a vulture, and he quickly looked away. His gaze swept across Miss Habbersfield's yard.
That's quite a bit of lawn decoration you have there,
Reggie said awkwardly. Miss Habbersfield looked back at the garden gnome at the corner of her front steps. It smiled its usual gentle smile, eyes strangely sensitive. Same as always, with its red hat and overalls, pick on its shoulder.
Isn't it, darling? It's the strangest thing. He just turned up in my garden a little while ago.
What? Really?
Oh, yes. Someone must have thought my garden was missing something, so they just left him there without even ringing the bell.
Reggie looked away from the garden gnome, but he felt strangely uncomfortable. It was almost as if he could feel the gnome's painted stare on his back. Somehow its eyes and knowing smirk followed him even as he decided to walk back to his own house. A quick note from the writer, Sean. Back before we were even dating, my now wife bought a copy of my first book, Waves of Mutilation, which is a zombie novel. There's a scene in it with a dog that she told me made her have to put the book down for a while, which I thought was the most wonderful compliment. Somewhat surprising, she did start dating me afterwards and eventually agreed to marry me as well. And I've been killing dogs ever since. Just like in real life, it always gets a reaction. My boyfriend always insists I take my glasses off before sex, so last night I decided to fool him by wearing contacts. It was going well until I saw him prop his phone up on the dresser. And with that, our time together is coming to an end. As always, I'd like to thank the writers who let me read their stories today. I am quite surprised that Sean's wife married him after reading how he was able to kill a dog in such grotesque detail that she had to put down the book. Of course, I'm assuming because I've never read the book myself, but that's the only reason I would have to put down a book is because it was just too over the top for me to read. She's a brave woman, and you are right that killing and hurting animals, let alone dogs, does grab people's attentions. Just please do me a favor and don't do it in real life. I might have to call someone on you, and I don't want to being able to read your stories. So let's just keep it on the pages. And just so you know, I do have a playlist specifically for this writer because I've read quite a few of his stories. So if you want to check out more from him, check out the playlist. Now, if you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and make sure it feels it. If you're new, subscribe and turn that pretty little bell to all notifications. And of course, I would love a comment. Use the phrase Rocky Ravine so I know you got this far. And of course, if you'd like to help the channel grow, just sharing this video or the channel itself with anyone who might enjoy it helps quite a bit. But if you'd like to help in other ways and get some bonuses, I do have Patreon and YouTube memberships. Both get early access to the long-form videos, but YouTube memberships does get early access to the 2-sentence horrors if that's something you're interested in. And if you'd like to do a one-time donation, I do have PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. All the links, including the ones to my social medias and websites, are in the description box for you guys. But as always, thank you for watching and listening. It always has and always will mean the world to me. Sleep tight and don't let 42 bite.